Imagine a kingdom that sits on top of the world's second largest oil reserves, commands the most powerful military in the Arab world, controls the holiest cities in Islam, and yet, for 80 years, has paid almost nothing for its own protection. Nothing. Zero. Because the most powerful country on earth was standing right behind it with the biggest military umbrella ever built. Now imagine that same kingdom watching that umbrella slowly start to fold, watching its neighbors get bombed, watching Iran stack up centrifuges like poker chips, watching Israel carry out strikes on a Gulf capital city like it owned the region, watching Washington respond not with force, but with press releases. And so, one day in the autumn of 2025, Mohammed bin Salman flew to Washington. Not to ask for permission, not to beg for reassurance. He flew there to rewrite the rules entirely. What he walked away with that day was not just a defense deal. It was not just a nuclear cooperation agreement. It was a complete restructuring of who protects who in the Middle East. And for the first time in history, Saudi Arabia made America a deal where Washington would actually be the one getting paid. That is the story of Saudi Arabia's so-called $0 nuclear shield. And it changes everything you think you know about power, money, and survival in the most dangerous neighborhood on earth. To understand what happened on November 18th, 2025, you have to go back 80 years, back to 1945. The war in Europe was nearly over. Franklin D. Roosevelt, returning from the Yalta Conference, made a stop that most history books skip right over. He sailed to the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt, and on the deck of an American warship called the USS Quincy, he met a man who had never left his homeland before, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of Saudi Arabia. A man who had united warring desert tribes by force and faith into a single kingdom sitting on top of what would soon be discovered as the largest energy reserves on the planet. What those two men agreed to on that ship deck became the invisible skeleton of the modern Middle East. America would provide military protection. Saudi Arabia would provide oil. No formal treaty, no written guarantee. Just a handshake between two men who understood that each needed what the other had. This arrangement, oil for security, became one of the most consequential deals in modern history. It put American warships in the Persian Gulf. It put American fighter jets on Saudi runways. It built American military bases across the Arabian Peninsula. And for 8 decades, Saudi Arabia essentially outsourced its survival to Washington. But here's the part nobody talks about. Saudi Arabia, one of the wealthiest nations per capita on earth, was getting this protection essentially free. Yes, it bought American weapons, enormous quantities of them. Yes, it sold America oil at reliable prices. But in terms of actually paying Washington to station its forces nearby, to scramble its jets if missiles appeared on radar, to park its aircraft carriers in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia paid almost nothing for that service directly. The burden of maintaining U.S. military dominance across the Middle East was carried mostly by the American taxpayer and the American defense budget. Riyadh benefited enormously from this arrangement while maintaining the freedom to complain about American policy, to hedge with Russia and China, and to play all sides simultaneously. That was the old deal. What happened in November 2025 was the death of the old deal and the birth of something entirely different. To understand why everything changed, you have to understand what happened to the Middle East between 2023 and 2025, because those 2 years were genuinely extraordinary. The region went through convulsions that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. It started with October 7th, 2023. The Hamas attack on Israel pulled the entire region into an escalating conflict that refused to stay contained. And then, in the summer of 2025, came the event that changed everything in the Gulf, something called the 12-Day War. Israel launched a devastating military campaign against Iran. It struck Iranian nuclear facilities. It hit Iranian military infrastructure. And in a move that shocked every Gulf state watching from the sidelines, Israel struck targets in Doha, Qatar, on September 9th, 2025. Hitting Hamas political leaders who were gathered to discuss a ceasefire. Let that settle in for a moment. A Middle Eastern country hit the capital city of a Gulf state, a city that hosts the largest American military base in the entire region, Al Udeid Air Base, and Washington's response was not military retaliation. It was diplomacy, phone calls, condemnations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio visited Israel amid heightened tensions, but American jets did not scramble to punish the attacker. For Saudi Arabia, that moment was the sound of the old guarantee cracking. If Israel could strike Qatar's capital, a city with American soldiers inside it, and face no military consequences from Washington, what exactly was the American security umbrella worth? The Saudis remembered what happened in 2019 when Iranian-backed attacks devastated their own oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais, cutting Saudi oil production in half overnight. Trump was president then too. He called it an act of war. He threatened consequences. And then he did nothing. No military retaliation, nothing. The word of the United States, as a security guarantor, had begun to feel like a promissory note from a bank that kept changing its terms. Saudi Arabia had to think differently, and it did. On September 17, 2025, just 8 days after Israel struck Doha, Mohammed bin Salman sat down at the Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh with Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. What they signed that day was the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. The language of the agreement was precise and deliberate. Any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. Now, that phrasing alone might sound like boilerplate diplomatic language. Countries sign agreements like that all the time. But this agreement was different. Because Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state, the only Muslim-majority nation on earth with confirmed nuclear weapons. And when Pakistani Defense Minister Khawaja Mohammad Asif was asked directly on television whether the nuclear deterrence Pakistan possesses would be made available to Saudi Arabia under this agreement, he said, and this sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry in the world, "What we have and the capabilities we possess will be made available according to this agreement." He later walked that back somewhat. A senior Saudi official, speaking to Reuters on condition of anonymity, said that the agreement is a comprehensive defensive agreement that encompasses all military means, but did not explicitly confirm nuclear sharing. The text of the pact was never officially published. The Belfer Center at Harvard analyzed it and concluded the agreement was primarily a political signal of solidarity and strategic cooperation, rather than an unconditional war guarantee. But here is what matters. The signal was sent loudly, clearly. Saudi Arabia was telling Washington and Tel Aviv and Tehran that it had options, that it would not sit passively waiting for an American president to decide whether Saudi lives were worth defending on any given day, that it could reach for nuclear deterrence through other means, and that it was fully prepared to do exactly that. This was not just strategy. This was negotiating leverage, and MBS was about to use it. 2 months later, on November 18, 2025, Mohammed bin Salman arrived at the White House for his first visit to Washington in 7 years. The last time he had been there, he was under the cloud of Jamal Khashoggi's murder in 2018, which U.S. intelligence had concluded he ordered. The relationship between Riyadh and Washington had been tense, transactional, and frequently uncomfortable ever since. The Biden years were particularly strained. Biden had called Saudi Arabia a pariah state during his campaign. He had restricted some arms sales. He had lectured Riyadh on human rights. MBS had responded by cutting oil production at a moment that hurt American consumers and made Biden look powerless. But now Trump was back. And Trump had already made his priorities clear. In May 2025, on his very first foreign trip of his second term, he flew not to London or Paris or Berlin, the traditional first stop for American presidents reassuring European allies. He flew to Riyadh, and he came home with a commitment of $600 billion in Saudi investment in the United States. Now, in November, MBS was coming to collect on the next phase of the relationship, and both men knew exactly what the other needed. The White House announced a series of landmark agreements signed that day. Let's go through them one by one, because together they represent the most comprehensive restructuring of the U.S.-Saudi relationship since Roosevelt met Ibn Saud on that warship in 1945. First, the Strategic Defense Agreement. The White House described it as a historic agreement that strengthens our more than 80-year defense partnership and fortifies deterrence across the Middle East. It expanded U.S. military access rights in Saudi Arabia. It formalized new cooperation frameworks. And here is the part that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage highlighted properly. The White House fact sheet explicitly stated that the SDA secures new burden-sharing funds from Saudi Arabia to defray U.S. costs. Read that again. Saudi Arabia is now paying the United States for the cost of America's own defensive presence in the region. The nation that spent 80 years being protected essentially for free is now writing a check to cover Washington's expenses. This is where the $0 nuclear shield framing comes from, and it has to be understood correctly. For most of those 80 years, Saudi Arabia's security cost the kingdom almost nothing in direct payments to the U.S. Now, under the new SDA, Saudi Arabia is funding its own protection. The era of free security is over. And remarkably, Saudi Arabia agreed to it because it gets so much more in return. As part of the deal, Trump approved the future delivery of F-35 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. That sentence requires a moment of appreciation. The F-35 is the most advanced stealth combat aircraft ever built. Its sensors, its radar-evading capability, its data networking, these are technologies the United States has guarded like crown jewels. Until this deal, in the entire Middle East, only one country operated F-35s, Israel. For 15 years, Israel has held this monopoly, and that monopoly has been a central pillar of what U.S. law calls Israel's qualitative military edge, the American legal requirement to ensure Israel always maintains decisive technological superiority over its neighbors. Giving F-35s to Saudi Arabia does not eliminate that edge overnight, but it fundamentally reshapes the regional balance. Saudi Arabia reportedly requested 48 aircraft at between $5, $3 and $5, $7 billion for the aircraft alone, not counting munitions, spare parts, logistics, or the decade of training required. This is one of the most significant arms transfers in Middle Eastern history. Saudi Arabia will also receive a standard export configured F-35A, the same version sold to Japan, South Korea, and Australia, not the specialized Israeli variant with its classified modifications, but even the baseline F-35 transforms what the Royal Saudi Air Force can do. In addition, Saudi Arabia agreed to purchase nearly 300 American Abrams tanks, and Trump formally designated Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally, a status that places Riyadh in the same category as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Israel, nations that have a privileged formalized security relationship with Washington without the binding treaty obligations of NATO membership. Second, the Nuclear Cooperation Declaration. This is the agreement that carries the most long-term significance and also the most ambiguity. The White House announced the signing of a joint declaration on the completion of negotiations on civil nuclear energy cooperation. The language confirms that the United States and American companies will be Saudi Arabia's civil nuclear cooperation partners of choice for a decades-long, multi-billion-dollar nuclear energy partnership. Saudi Arabia has been trying to build nuclear reactors for years. The kingdom has been soliciting bids from South Korea, France, China, Russia, and the United States. It has an enormous and growing demand for electricity. It is one of the highest per capita electricity consumers in the world, and it wants to free up its oil and gas for export rather than burning it domestically to power air conditioners and desalination plants. 2 pressurized water reactors are planned at a site called Duaihin, and Saudi Arabia sits on substantial uranium reserves of its own, making the entire nuclear fuel cycle, from digging the ore out of the ground to generating electricity, potentially self-sufficient within the kingdom's borders. But here is the nuclear-armed elephant in the room. For years, the central sticking point in U.S.-Saudi nuclear negotiations has been enrichment. Enriching uranium is the process of increasing the concentration of the fissile isotope, U-235, the same process that, taken far enough, produces weapons-grade material. The United States has long insisted that countries receiving American nuclear technology agree to the gold standard, a prohibition on domestic uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing, and acceptance of intrusive IAEA inspections. The UAE accepted this gold standard back in 2009, and its Baraka nuclear plant, built with U.S. cooperation, now supplies roughly 25% of the UAE's electricity. Saudi Arabia has refused to accept the gold standard. MBS said it directly in September 2023 on Fox News. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, we have to get one. Saudi Arabia's energy minister has said publicly that the kingdom wants to go to the full cycle, to producing the uranium, enriching the uranium. This is not ambiguity. This is a sovereign government stating with extraordinary clarity that it sees enrichment as both an energy right and a potential deterrent backstop. So what does the November 18 declaration actually mean? U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright, the day after signing the declaration, said clearly on Fox News, no enrichment. In this agreement, this is just for construction of a power plant, American technology, American companies, to build a very large nuclear power plant in Saudi Arabia. He described the deal as being about generating electricity, not weapons. But experts were quick to note that what was signed is not the final agreement. It is a joint declaration, a framework, a commitment to complete a formal deal. The actual binding legal instrument, a Section 123 agreement under the U.S. Atomic Energy Act, has not yet been finalized or submitted to Congress. Section 123, agreements are the specific legal vehicles through which the United States can export nuclear reactor technology, nuclear fuel, and nuclear materials to another country. As of mid-2025, the U.S. had 26 such agreements in place globally. Any 123 agreement must meet specific non-proliferation criteria, must be certified by the President as serving U.S. defense and security interests, and must be reviewed by Congress for 90 days before entering into force. And both the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senators Jim Risch and John Shaheen, came out publicly the very next day saying that any 123 agreement with Saudi Arabia must be a gold standard agreement, no enrichment. Full IAEA additional protocol, no exceptions. President Trump, sitting next to MBS in the Oval Office when asked by reporters whether a formal nuclear deal would happen, said, "I can see that happening. It's not urgent." not urgent. A president known for his deal-making instincts was signaling that the enrichment question was still on the table for a future negotiation, a future where leverage and conditions may look very different. Third, the $1 trillion investment commitment. During the November meetings, MBS raised his total commitment of Saudi investment in the United States to $1 trillion, up from the $600 billion pledge during Trump's May visit to Riyadh. On November 19th, at the U.S.-Saudi Investment Forum in Washington, companies signed approximately $270 billion in deals in a single day. Among the centerpieces, Saudi Arabia agreed to purchase 600,000 NVIDIA AI chips for the Saudi artificial intelligence firm Humane. An AI memorandum of understanding was signed, giving Saudi Arabia access to leading American AI systems, while the White House noted protecting U.S. technology from foreign influence. Fourth, the critical minerals framework. This is the piece of the deal that rarely makes headlines but may matter most over the long term. Saudi Arabia sits on significant deposits of rare earth minerals, dysprosium, terbium, neodymium, praseodymium, materials that are essential for semiconductors, electric vehicle motors, advanced weapon systems, and medical technology. China currently dominates global rare earth processing, and this dependence has become a serious strategic vulnerability for the United States. The framework signed between the two countries aligns U.S. and Saudi national strategies to diversify supply chains away from Chinese control. In addition, Saudi Arabia's vast uranium reserves, centered on the Jabal Sayid deposit, could, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, eventually make the kingdom a critical supplier of enriched uranium to the U.S. nuclear industry, helping reduce American dependence on Russian uranium supplies that have flowed into U.S. reactors for decades. Now step back and look at the full picture of what happened in November 2025. Saudi Arabia arrived at the White House and walked away with F-35 stealth fighters, with 300 Abrams tanks, with major non-NATO ally status, with a civil nuclear cooperation declaration that kept the enrichment question deliberately vague enough to remain a future negotiating chip, with a defense agreement that formalized U.S. protection while also positioning Saudi Arabia as a paying partner rather than a dependent, with an AI deal, with a critical minerals framework, with a $1 trillion investment commitment that guarantees American economic interest in Saudi stability for the foreseeable future. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to pay burden-sharing costs, to buy American weapons, to route its strategic infrastructure through American companies rather than Chinese or Russian ones, to keep its nuclear ambitions inside a U.S.-supervised framework rather than going to Beijing or Moscow for reactors and fuel. For Washington, the deal also has a clear strategic logic. By anchoring Saudi Arabia to the American nuclear industry, the U.S. prevents China and Russia from becoming the dominant nuclear exporters to the world's most strategically critical region. Russia has been aggressively exporting nuclear reactor technology globally for years. China has been doing the same, and Saudi Arabia was clearly using the threat of going to Beijing as negotiating leverage throughout these talks. Trump reportedly shut down any Saudi attempt to use the Chinese option as a bargaining chip, but the fact that the option existed and was real forced Washington to offer terms it had resisted offering for years. But now we have to talk about what this deal means for the rest of the Middle East, because the consequences don't end at the Saudi border. They ripple outward, and they ripple fast. The first and most immediate concern is Iran. Iran's nuclear program, after the Israeli strikes on its facilities in June 2025, is in a state of profound uncertainty. IAEA inspections were suspended following the strikes. Nobody knows with confidence exactly how far Iran's enrichment program advanced before those strikes, or how quickly it could reconstitute. What is known is that Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% purity, a short technical step from weapons-grade levels of 90%. And analysts assessed Iran was close to having enough fissile material for multiple weapons, if it chose to complete the final steps. The Arms Control Association, writing in early 2026, assessed that both Saudi Arabia and South Korea are likely to move closer to developing fissile material production capabilities in 2026, with the active support of the United States, a development they described as carrying serious proliferation risks. The second concern is the domino effect. When the UAE agreed to the gold standard in 2009, it set a regional precedent. Its 123 agreement actually contains a specific provision stating that if the United States later offers more favorable terms to any other Middle Eastern country, the UAE has the right to request that its own agreement be revised upward to match. In plain language, if Saudi Arabia gets enrichment rights, the UAE will demand them too. And if the UAE gets them, Turkey will ask, Egypt will ask, Jordan will ask, And the non-proliferation architecture that has prevented a regional nuclear arms race for the last 50 years begins to dissolve. Researchers from the Livermore National Laboratory's Center for Global Security Research, in a May 2024 workshop on the nuclear future of the Middle East, identified exactly this scenario as a tipping point, a moment that could give way to regional nuclear breakout. They warned that if the United States gave in to Saudi Arabia's demands for domestic enrichment, the cascade would likely include Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, driven by security concerns, prestige, and regional competition, respectively. And then there's the third factor, which is perhaps the most extraordinary development in this entire story, the Pakistan angle. Saudi Arabia's September 2025 mutual defense agreement with nuclear-armed Pakistan was not signed in isolation. It was signed in the full knowledge that the kingdom was about to negotiate a nuclear and defense framework with the United States. The Pakistan deal gave MBS something invaluable going into those Washington talks, an alternative, a fallback. A signal that if Washington refused to provide adequate security guarantees, Riyadh could reach toward a nuclear deterrent through Islamabad. Whether Pakistan's nuclear umbrella would ever actually extend to cover Saudi Arabia in a genuine military crisis is deeply uncertain. The Belfer Center called the agreement primarily a political signal, but the ambiguity itself was the weapon. Saudi Arabia arrived in Washington in November 2025, holding more nuclear cards than it had ever held before. A declared interest in domestic enrichment backed by real uranium reserves, an agreement with a nuclear-armed Muslim ally, a credible threat to go to China or Russia for reactor technology, and a Trump administration desperately eager to claim credit for a transformative deal that would benefit the American defense industry, the American nuclear industry, and American geopolitical influence simultaneously. There are analysts who argue the November 2025 deal is genuinely historic and broadly positive. The Breakthrough Institute argued that by bringing Saudi Arabia into a U.S. supervised nuclear cooperation framework, Washington is actually reducing proliferation risk. If Saudi Arabia builds reactors with American technology, those reactors come with American oversight, American safeguards, and American leverage to ensure the program stays peaceful. Without an American agreement, Saudi Arabia goes to China or Russia, partners who apply far weaker non-proliferation standards. The deal forces transparency. An agreement with Washington, even an imperfect one, is better than no agreement at all. Others are far less confident. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said it plainly. Saudi Arabia's stated intention to acquire nuclear weapons if Iran does demands extreme caution. We must not fuel a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Her Republican counterpart, Senator Jim Risch, insisted the gold standard has to be included in any final 123 agreement, and the Arms Control Association warned in early 2026 that reports suggest the deal might include a unique bilateral U.S. EAS, Saudi Safeguards Arrangement to supplement IAEA monitoring, a deviation from standard practice that could set a precedent for other countries seeking less intrusive inspection regimes. Trump himself, when asked whether a formal nuclear deal was coming, offered 5 words that may be the most important 5 words anyone said during the entire summit. I can see that happening. Not a commitment, not a promise, a signal. The enrichment question was not resolved in November 2025. It was deferred. And in geopolitics, what gets deferred doesn't disappear, it grows. Here is what we know with certainty as of early 2026. Saudi Arabia does not yet have nuclear weapons. It does not yet have nuclear reactors. The formal 123 agreement has not been submitted to Congress and may still be months or years away. The enrichment question remains the hardest, most consequential point of contention in any final deal. Saudi Arabia has not signed the IAEA's additional protocol, which would provide inspectors with enhanced access to Saudi nuclear sites, though it did rescind its small quantities protocol in 2024, bringing it under standard comprehensive safeguards for the first time. Iran's nuclear program is in post-strike disarray, but that disarray is temporary. History shows that states determined to develop nuclear capabilities eventually find a way, and a Saudi Arabia that watches Iran reconstitute its nuclear program after a war, after international inspections were suspended, after the world's response was diplomatic rather than decisive, will face exactly the pressure MBS described in 2023. If Iran gets one, Saudi Arabia will follow. The new U.S. Saudi's strategic defense agreement changes the financial architecture of Middle Eastern security. Saudi Arabia is now a paying partner in its own defense rather than a passive beneficiary. It holds a major non-NATO ally designation. It has been approved for the F-35, still pending full congressional review, and nearly 300 Abrams tanks. It has locked in American companies as its nuclear partners of choice. And it has made clear to everyone watching that it will not wait indefinitely for Washington to decide how much its security is worth. The $1 trillion investment pledge ensures that American economic interests are deeply woven into Saudi Arabia's future for decades. The critical minerals framework ensures that Saudi resources will flow into American supply chains rather than Chinese ones. The AI memorandum ensures that American technology, not Chinese or Russian technology, shapes the kingdom's digital future. In return, Saudi Arabia got almost everything it wanted, except the explicit right to enrich uranium, which remains unresolved, which means the most important negotiation is still ahead of us. What does all of this mean for the Middle East? It means the region is entering an era it has never experienced before. An era where nuclear technology is spreading to Arab states, where the gold standard of non-proliferation is being tested to its limit, where the United States is simultaneously trying to prevent nuclear proliferation and actively helping two of its closest allies, Saudi Arabia and South Korea, move toward the capability to produce fissile material. An era where Pakistan may be extending a nuclear umbrella over an Arab Gulf state for the first time in history, where Israel has shattered the taboo against striking Gulf capital cities, where Iran's nuclear status is more uncertain than at any point since the 2015 nuclear deal was signed and then torn up. The Roosevelt-Ibn Saud handshake in 1945 created 80 years of relative stability built on one simple transaction: oil for security. That transaction has now been replaced by something vastly more complicated: security in exchange for weapons purchases, investment pledges, mineral access, technology alignment, and burden-sharing payments, protection with strings attached, nuclear strings, commercial strings, geopolitical strings, and somewhere inside the fine print of a deal that still has its most important chapter unwritten, the question of whether the world's most volatile region will enter a nuclear age of its own. Mohammed bin Salman flew into Washington in November 2025 and walked out with the most significant security upgrade in Saudi Arabia's history. He also walked out with the most significant unanswered question in the Middle East's future. Not whether Saudi Arabia will have nuclear power, that is already decided, but whether it will someday have the other thing, the thing that Iran has been reaching for, the thing that Israel has quietly held for decades, the thing that changes every calculation, every border dispute, every proxy war, every oil pricing meeting forever. The $0 shield is gone. Something new has taken its place. And nobody, not in Riyadh, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Tel Aviv, knows exactly what it will become.